should should we be worried about Neuralink and companies like Neuralink? Yes, but not for the reason you might think. So, hi everybody, my name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience, and one of the sort of perennial topics that's come up ever since I started discussing topics in neuroscience on Periscope. Remember Periscope? Ever since I started having those conversations years ago, one of the most consistent topics that came up was brain-computer interfaces. And of course, as is the case with a variety of sectors of technology and engineering, a particular company associated with a particular person has sort of catapulted to the top of my fellow sci-fi nerds' minds when the topic of brain-computer interfaces comes up: Neuralink. So Neuralink. Now, I should note that I've discussed brain-computer interfaces in several discussions in the past, to which I've linked down below in the discussion section, including some devoted specifically to Neuralink, as well as companies and entities who've made, various kinds of progress towards the development of an effective brain-computer interface. And so, there are several videos, but if you're interested in exploring more than just Neuralink, more than just that one company, I'd bring your attention to a discussion I had about a company called Braingate. So that's the thumbnail. That's not their logo. That's the thumbnail for my video. Just because it'll give you a sense, like a better idea of other general approaches to the goal of creating a brain-computer interface, and just give you an idea of like the progress that companies outside of Neuralink have made towards achieving that goal. But I do think it's worth revisiting Neuralink specifically once again, and for one specific reason. Neuralink is hiring a director of clinical trials. And so, since the last time I discussed Neuralink, the company that the company's made a bit of progress, right, since the last time I talked about them, or at least has put out content that seems to indicate that they have. And so, what you are about to see here is a rhesus macaque who has, according to Neuralink, of course, been implanted with 2 Neuralink devices. And so I don't know where precisely in the brain these devices are implanted, and we'll see a picture in just a second that may give us a hint as to where in the brain is, but you can see it seems like it may be the occipital cortex, with the other maybe in the somatosensory cortex, just judging from some bald spots that you'll be able to see in a picture after this. And so monkeys love juice, and they'll do a lot of things for juice, and the monkey is basically controlling. It's sort of like Pong, right? And I think later on in the video the monkey does actually literally play Pong, but he's navigating this cursor, or he or she, I'm not sure, navigating that white cursor to the illuminated box. And that joystick actually is not like plugged in. It's just sort of like a cue for the monkey to use to just sort of like associate the intention to move the cursor with something that's a little bit more intuitive, like moving a joystick. But anyways, yeah, if we take a look at some bald spots on the top of the monkey's head, you can sort of see maybe where they implanted it, which is like one towards the posterior of the brain, towards the back, and one a little bit further anterior. And yeah, I mean, but I'm still just guessing that's where the implants are. This speculation is an example of one of the reasons that I brought this up today. I have literally no way to know what on earth is actually going on in that video, because they're treating this like the release of the next iPhone or NVIDIA graphics card or something, rather than like typical scientific innovation. There's no paper that I can review for that demonstration. There are no anatomical demonstrations of where in the brain, of non-human primates these devices have landed. Did they implant in the somatosensory cortex? Did they intend for it to be implanted in the somatosensory cortex? Did the other one land in the visual cortex of the occipital lobe? Did it, hit the right layer of the visual cortex? Did they even have a particular layer of the visual cortex in mind as like their goal for this demonstration? Do they even care what layer of the visual cortex, their implant targets? So to date, and really Elon Musk, has taken what appears to be an almost identical approach to rolling out updates on the progress at Neuralink as he does with like Tesla, right? Sort of big stage-based kind of demonstrations, mimicking the approach of like maybe Steve Jobs and sort of, pseudo-spiritual stage-based celebrations of the latest Apple products. anyways, I explored one of the more recent demonstrations before this one with the monkey in one of the past discussions on the topic, that I have linked below, where they show what appears to be a pig who has a Neuralink device implanted, generating a kind of readout of, it was recording neuronal activity wirelessly, which, to be clear, is very cool, but also not exactly groundbreaking, and so you can check out the discussion below if you'd like to hear why. But that's basically what this company has done so far, right? Release things like, the video of the monkey playing Pong, and the wireless electrophysiology of the pig poking around with its snout. And, they're all super duper fun, and probably the most effective, possible approach to demonstrating new technologies like this, right? And if, regardless of what I say about this, like, I sincerely hope that they keep doing exactly that kind of thing, right? It takes a kind of research and work that's not exactly appetizing on a day-to-day basis. And, what they're doing is delivering these wonderful, beautiful, intelligible demonstrations of the technology, and I'm all for that. But what's missing is a process that's absolutely central to what distinguishes science from essentially every other discipline: peer review. And so, peer review has taken a bit of a beating over the past several years for a whole variety of reasons, most of which are attributable to the publication process, not necessarily like peer review itself, and the companies that own those publications. But despite this, and in my opinion, whoa, that was weird. Anyways, it sounds like there's an ogre. I live in an apartment building and it just shook a little bit. It's kind of creepy. Anyway, so this, in my mind, regarding peer review, not the ogre, regarding peer review, I think it does have some, temporary and curable debilitations, right? Despite these deficiencies in the peer review process, it's still an entirely unique component of how innovation occurs, in the world of science. And so, I'm not going to dive into that whole topic of peer review. It's definitely a topic for another day. But if you've ever wondered, what exactly distinguishes the disciplines of like engineering and medicine and science, in addition to like the specific nature of like how members of those fields are trained, obviously what's unique to science is the peer review process. And so, I'm not arguing that like, a training in science is somehow superior to, other STEM fields. They all have their own sort of versions of peer review. But in science, you don't make progress in your career until other scientists have done their best to poke holes in the arguments and demonstrations that you've made, until they've tried to find out where you've made mistakes or conducted, maybe you did some subpar experiments or missed important knowledge that was already out there at the time that you started your work. In science, or at least most scientific disciplines, certainly including neuroscience, without publishing your work in scientific journals, you simply cannot progress in your career. And, you cannot publish in scientific journals without having the work you've done undergo peer review, right? In a sort of cold and like practical way, you can't demonstrate the smart ideas that you had until other scientists who know their stuff, who are incentivized to figure out, why you're not smarter than they are, right? Until those other scientists get a chance to figure out where you went wrong, you're not going to make career progress. And so, it's a rough part of the life of a scientist, believe me. And this is a whole, broader discussion, and it's absolutely not a perfect process, of course, but it's a pretty unique aspect to science. And, other disciplines, even technical disciplines, don't quite have an analog. I mean, I guess, one could make the argument that the market is what peer reviews the work of engineers. And I suppose that's pretty true in many circumstances, but, I think that sort of brings us to a reason that we might need to be a little bit worried about Neuralink. Essentially none of their demonstrations have been subject to peer review. None of them have been scrutinized by scientists and engineers who literally work in precisely the same field, who can then let us know. Those of us who aren't necessarily directly involved in this work, they can let us know, if the claims that the company makes are legit. And so, to be fair, like the company has published in peer-reviewed journals, okay? And that's it. So this was published in 2019 on Halloween. I'm not even kidding. On October 31st, 2019, no one's ever accused Elon Musk of letting an opportunity to meme go to waste, right? But, anyways, I'll be honest, like, this isn't a journal that's ever been on my radar, right? It is both peer-reviewed, and it is a pretty substantial impact factor, meaning that, like, a good number of scientists within the field are likely to see it and review it. So, it's definitely no joke. But this paper is really just a demonstration of the sort of basic components of their device, which you can see here. And so they're showing us on the top the tool that's used to implant the main event of Neuralink, the actual device, right? Do you see those like sort of thread string-like things there? They call those threads appropriately. And they're basically like very, very long electrodes with little points along them that enable the electrodes to interact with multiple parts of the brain along their entire length, or not their entire length, but a large, portion of their length. So it's sort of like, imagine if you have an arm, right? Or two, right? And you have, hands at the end of your arm, right? You can stick your arm in any one direction or another, and then use your hand to grasp, something, push, itch, scratch, whatever, pull. But you only have one hand at the end of your arm. So these Neuralink threads that you can see down here at the bottom are like if you had hands running along the entire length of your arm, right? So you can stick your arm in a certain direction, and you can manipulate anything and everything along the length of your arm in that direction. Like if you were like super itchy across your chest, right, your entire chest, and you could just rest your arm along your chest and have all those hands, along your arm scratch your entire chest simultaneously. It's kind of trippy, I know, but that's the kind of idea behind this device. Instead of only being able to listen to the activities of neurons that are at the end of the implant, which is how traditional electrodes work, even fancy electrodes like tetrodes, which is something I used. But instead of working like traditional electrodes, these threads are able to listen in on the populations of neurons that are close to basically any point along that arm, right? So who cares? I actually did a bit of work with on a project that was trying to achieve something kind of similar, right? I did a bit of work using what are called tetrodes, right? Which, for any language nerds out there, exactly what they sound like, right? Which you can sort of see here on the bottom there. Right there in the middle, where, labeled tetrode, you can see basically like 4 pipes right next to each other. And so a tetrode is a cluster of 4 electrodes that are all targeting one particular part of the brain. Right, and an electrode is basically just a very thin bit of metal, sort of like a fishing line, that we can use to listen to changes in electrical activity. So it's sort of like if you were to put a microphone at the end of a very long pole, right? You can hear what people might be saying in the next room, right? Things you'd never be able to hear, from the room in which you're sitting, because you have that microphone on a long pole, right? Recording sounds far away from where you are. That's basically what an electrode is. But when it comes to tetrodes, because you have more than one electrode, 4 electrodes, because you have multiple electrodes in a single tetrode, you can get a much better sense of where exactly in the brain neuronal activity originates. And so, what you can do is you can implant like a few dozen tetrodes, so many, many dozens of electrodes, all clustered into 4, which are then all those tetrodes are clustered together in an implant. And so in other words, to listen in on a whole brain region as opposed to just some neurons in a brain region. But the limitation of tetrodes compared to something like these Neuralink threads, is that you're only listening in on neuronal activity at the very ends of those tetrodes. So even if you have several dozen tetrodes implanted at dozens of different parts of the brain, you're still only listening to several dozen specific points in the brain. And so when it comes to some of the newer innovations on devices that enable us to listen in on activity in the brain, the idea is instead of only listening to what's going on at the ends of recording devices, right, electrodes, tetrodes, you can listen in on the entire length of the electrode, like having all those hands along the length of your arm, right? And so, I should note that Neuralink is not the only company, and certainly not the first entity, who's developed something like this. So NeuroPixels, for example, which you can see here, NeuroPixels accomplish essentially the same goal of massively expanding the ability of electrodes to listen in on a much larger swath of the brain at any one time. And so basically, you see that sort of checkerboard, pattern up there? Instead of just recording at the very tip of that spike, NeuroPixels enable us to listen on the activities of populations of neurons all along the length of the implant. And to be clear, NeuroPixels were announced in 2017, and NeuroPixels were developed at Genelia in Virginia, which is sort of like the Central Research Institute of HHMI, which is not quite the equivalent of a company. And Genelia is an interesting entity in the landscape of the world of science, right? And more on that later. But the point is that the fundamental goal of massively expanding, the ability of an electrode to listen in on a vastly greater number of neurons simultaneously has both been a major goal within neuroscience and engineering, neuroengineering, as well as a goal to which many groups have been substantively contributing. And so, that said, this publication from Neuralink, up here, in 2019 definitely demonstrates something super fascinating and exciting, despite the fact that NeuroPixels beat them by 2 years. Specifically from what I can tell, here we'll bring their stuff back. But from what I can tell, it looks like their threads, they're equivalent of electrodes, right? Their threads look like they're flexible. That's a really big deal. And I'll be honest though, when I saw that they were flexible, like intentionally flexible, my first thought as someone who, was trying to target a very, very small, very specific part of the brain with tetrodes, the medial habenula, basically the size of like a microscopic fingernail. My first thought when thinking about using something like tetrodes that are super flexible, nightmare, total and absolute nightmare. Because, the fundamental challenge that I encountered when I was, working with tetrodes was that they bend. And I was trying to target a structure that's like literally a few hundred microns thick. So, about a few human hairs thick. And depending on where you hit it along the structure, just one human hair in some parts, smaller than, thinner than a human hair in some parts. But keep in mind, I was working with tetrodes, and tetrodes can only record at the very tip of the electrodes. And so this Neuralink device can record along its length. So that would have solved quite a few problems. It would also introduce a whole new set of problems, but that's a topic for another day. The point is, right? Have you ever tried to use like a tape measure over a fairly long distance, right? Like long enough where the rigid part of the tape starts to bend and you can't quite reach where you're trying to get, and then you need to call someone over to hold the other end so it doesn't bend, and it's a 2-person job now. And it's a very similar situation when it comes to implanting even marginally flexible electrodes. When you're trying to record from neurons that are fairly deep in the brain, where you have to travel through a lot of brain tissue to actually arrive at your destination, even marginally flexible electrodes or tetrodes will bend and deviate from, your intended trajectory. And so when I saw, the basic premise of Neuralink's device, I thought 2 things. First, this would be an absolute nightmare. Second, they can't possibly have had any experience trying to target a particularly small brain region. But, that was a largely emotional reaction from my trauma over the course of graduate school. When I then thought about the incredible advantages that being able to record along the entire length of the threads and the ability to implant in a very intentional way so you can avoid moving through certain structures that are extremely critical to, staying alive, I sort of realized that this could be a non-issue, that they bend, right? And, it's more complicated than that, and there's a whole additional set of challenges that will emerge from trying to exploit the ability of recording the activities of neurons along the entire length of the implant that you're trying to get a sense, of the activities of specific brain regions. But even those issues are absolutely solvable problems, right? Hard problems, for sure, but solvable problems. And then, they also include what they call a robotic insertion device. And I can't quite understand, how it is that one of those threads could possibly reach, each of the brain regions that are lower than just the outer regions of the brain. I mean, this is supposedly the device that accomplishes that. I just can't imagine how they can actually thread one of these threads to anything lower, more subcortical than the cortex. But that's part of this paper. It's not using only the apparatus that I had, right? And essentially everyone, including like people who do neurosurgery on humans, they're not just using that device, a stereotactic apparatus. There's an additional device that helps guide their threads to the final destination within the brain. We'll take their word for it. All right, so this was all published at the end of 2019, okay? And it's certainly not nothing. Definitely some real and some useful innovation going on here. And, I can only imagine how excited I'd be if I were starting graduate school and starting to devise my own dissertation project again, and, how excited I would be to be able to potentially use something like this. But, as I brought up with NeuroPixels, it's not really like a massive leap forward, right? It's not like they've invented a technology that's so alien compared to the state of affairs in science 2 years prior, right? That said, since its publication, they did their pig demonstration, and then they put out their monkey demonstration, right? And, now they're hiring a clinical trials director, meaning they're moving from, non-human, models, animal models, to humans. And so, I'm fairly certain that, no neural pixel has been implanted into a human. And so that's a major step forward, right? As far as I can tell, only Braingate, right, that company I talked about a while back in a separate video, as far as I know, Braingate is, is pretty much the only entity that's made serious progress with humans and like sophisticated brain-computer interfaces. So this is a big deal, right, that they're hiring a clinical trial director at Neuralink. And it's super exciting, given what they've demonstrated in their video with the monkey playing Pong with its brain alone, wirelessly too. Definitely very cool. But, none of this is cause for worry so far. So let's get to that. So, I've used the term companies quite a bit so far, and that makes sense. After all, these are all companies that are typically, discussed when, exploring progress in brain-computer interfaces, even in the case of Braingate, which is the byproduct, however, of a collaboration between a variety of academic and medical institutions, and they publish in peer-reviewed journals, right? The entity is fundamentally a private sector entity. While the group of individuals contributing to the effort includes a lot of scientists at academic institutions, as well as physicians affiliated with health systems like Massachusetts General Hospital, the ultimate entity that's driving the development of Braingate is a private company. And so for me, irrespective of the specific form that any given whole brain-computer interface takes, right, the prospect that one particular company, a company that is not subject to the concerns of most humans, I don't know about you, but the prospect that one specific company would, entirely own such a transformational device just makes me pause for a little bit. So take a look at the number of scientists who contributed to the development of neuropixels up here. All that sort of teal, those are all the names of authors. This was neuropixels in 2017, right? Now take a look at the number of people who contributed to what I believe is the only peer-reviewed publication out of Neuralink. Again, just the sort of teal colors. I'm going to go ahead and guess that Elon Musk wasn't sitting at a bench fabricating their threads for Neuralink. Obviously the inclusion of Neuralink, right? That's the senior author. In science, the last listed author is typically considered the senior author unless indicated otherwise. And then the first author is like the person who is the main scientist that was sort of like driving all the research. I'm guessing Elon Musk didn't spend all that much time in the lab, but obviously the inclusion of Neuralink, in the authors is intended to represent the entirety of the company, right? And it's not like this is the only example of a company publishing in academic literature in this way. This is an academic journal, JMIR. But you can get a sense of the difference in the roles that any one scientist or engineer plays in the development of this technology, right? They don't contribute as the individual thinkers or entities. They contribute to the company. And the company is the entity that owns whatever it is that the collection of scientists and engineers creates. It's just a fundamentally different model compared to the, traditional scientific model. The scientists at Genelia depend on being able to publish in peer-reviewed journals, and not only publish, but have their specific names attached to that publication. They put their reputations on the line. And when somebody breaks a law in any big way, like setting up a Ponzi scheme or something, everybody knows, after they're caught, to not work with them, right? Like, I sort of hope that people aren't going to be investing in Elizabeth Holmes, from Theranos' next big venture. When it comes to Neuralink, everything is kind of more ambiguous, right? The private sector has a sort of similar situation. Scientists and engineers will depend on the recommendations and the resumes, the recommendations from, their supervisors at any given company, and the resumes will have Neuralink on it. But still, right, the scientists at Genelia are still operating like academic scientists. They're putting their names on a specific publication, and that specific publication, which demonstrates their innovations, has been vetted by other scientists and engineers through peer review. For Neuralink, we have no idea who did what, right? And as far as I can tell, ever since 2019, that 2019 Neuralink publication on Halloween, we don't have much beyond the videos that they put out. And, while the videos are very cool, no doubt, they're not even remotely close to as reliable as a publication in a peer-reviewed journal. And so that's one reason we should be worried, in my opinion, right? My humble opinion. Just how reliable are these videos? Right? It's not hard to fake these demonstrations. If I was an investor, for example, if I had that kind of cash sitting around, I'd be at least somewhat apprehensive, somewhat concerned about that. However, at least in my mind, that's not actually the main reason I think we should just take a beat and think about things for a second. So beyond the differences in the nature of, the scientific process, between an entity like Neuralink and an entity like Genelia, the differences become even more significant when an academic institution versus a private sector entity develops a paradigm-shifting technology. So let's just imagine, for just a second, that Neuralink does indeed succeed in developing an outrageously effective and comprehensive brain-computer interface. Let's all just take a bit of melange and put on our Holtzman shields, right, and travel to Arrakis. And what would a world in which one specific company has developed a brain-computer interface that's light years ahead of any prior technology? Well, just take a look, right, at the number of authors on this Neuralink and Genelia paper, these papers again. For one of these scientific publications, we see a whole collection of brilliant individuals at Genelia who contributed to the beautiful manifestation of human brilliance, right? They're all accountable for what's in this paper. For the other, I can only see one single human name, right? And so, he's accountable for what's in that paper, right? And that's fine, given how the company's structured, obviously. But that also means that he's entirely in control of every single decision regarding what is done with this device. And more importantly, what's done with the information that the device generates, right? So once again, we're entering the science fiction world where Neuralink has developed a profoundly effective brain-computer interface, and you're able to instantaneously see and experience the visual and emotional experiences of your loved one who moved, to Hong Kong from Kansas City, right, to study engineering, maybe, right? You're not wearing an Oculus Rift or anything like that, right? You're sitting in Kansas City, your sibling or your child or whatever, your partner is standing at the top of a skyscraper in Hong Kong, and you just immediately port into their sensory world, and you can see, hear, you can feel, you can experience what they're experiencing literally on the other side of the planet. In a world like that, the amount of information about every detail, every single detail regarding what's happening in your brain would inevitably be involved in enabling that whole amazing interaction to happen across Neuralinks, right? The device would need to be able to detect activity throughout a majority of the brain, and if not a majority, a massive proportion of your entire brain. The device would be sensitive to your innermost thoughts, right? Every single thought. If you feel like privacy has been destroyed in the world of social media, you ain't seen nothing yet, right? Every single thought, every idea, emotion, fantasy, everything would be detectable by this device. So the notion of something like privacy would be just ridiculous, right? The device would be capable of pervading every nook and cranny of your consciousness. And so in fact, it would have access to aspects of your consciousness of which you have very, very little awareness, right? I won't get into the whole iceberg metaphor to describe our conscious awareness versus our unconscious brain activity, but suffice it to say, there's a massive cascade of brain activity occurring at all times that plays a gigantic role in steering the choices that we make in our inner lives, over which we have zero control, essentially zero control. So a device like this, Neuralink, would have access, a fully matured Neuralink would have access to those unconscious processes. So in other words, it would be at least capable of truly knowing far, far more about you than you do, right? Than you, your parents, your partner, your spouse, your kids. It would know more about you than any other person could possibly ever know, including you. So now imagine that this device not only exists, but it's owned by one specific entity, and not only one specific entity, but a company, okay? And a company that's owned by one specific person. One human is in charge of every decision that company makes. And therefore, one specific human has access to the inner lives of every single person on the planet in whom this device is implanted. So I'm sure you can begin to see this sort of sci-fi post-apocalyptic picture that I'm painting here. That level of access and control afforded to just one person, would be a level of omniscience that couldn't possibly have ever existed before, right? If you think Google or Amazon or the CIA or whatever knows everything about you, they have nothing on what a technology like this would have. So, let's just go through some examples of what this might be like. Were you incredibly angry with somebody? Ever even imagine getting violent? But you totally kept calm and cordial on the outside, and the person had no idea. Neuralink would know. Did you find a particular person attractive and maybe even fantasize about having a relationship of some kind with them, right? But couldn't for whatever reason. You were, already married or whatever, in a relationship or whatever they were. That person never learns about it. Nobody knows except for you, but Neuralink would know. Did you want to drink more than you ultimately did, but you didn't, right? Did you want to indulge? Good for you. You didn't indulge, right? But Neuralink would know that you had that urge when others perhaps didn't, right? Did you consume a far more illicit substance in your history, right? Something that's totally illegal, an illegal drug. But there's zero evidence that you ever did. And so you can get jobs that would require you to be totally substance-free. Today, you'd get away with that. But Neuralink would know. And so, have you ever been totally slacking off at work, right? Scrolling through Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or YouTube, when your boss didn't know? Neuralink would know, Are you traveling 6 miles per hour, 10 kilometers per hour, over the speed limit, but no cop was around to give you a ticket? Well, you would know you were. And so does Neuralink. And once a system like Neuralink would know, there's no reason that law enforcement couldn't know. And so when it comes to, law enforcement, the notion of thought crime, like what's depicted in Minority Report, for example, that notion of being prosecuted for the mere emergence of thoughts becomes far more than just like a Twitter meme. If law enforcement finds that people who had demonstrated, 60% level of activity in XYZ, parts of the brain simultaneously or, in rapid sequence, they're likely to engage in a violent act, right? If that pattern of brain activity occurs, this person is likely in the future to, engage in violence. As ridiculous as that sounds, right? You'd have literally zero aspects of your consciousness that are exclusively your own, right? And so, thought crime, right now it's largely a meme, but with a device like this, it would be possible at least. And it, not just judging from people's posts on Facebook or whatever, And so once again, I think that's enough. But, this is still science fiction, completely science fiction. And, that's exclusively the bad stuff, right? There's also a ton of beautiful and transcendent, numinous possibilities that a technology like this would enable. It would fundamentally change what it means to be human in good and bad ways. And so, no one, and certainly including Neuralink, is remotely close to bringing that kind of future to fruition. However, the way that Elon Musk describes the aspirations of the company, of Neuralink, would indicate that such a technological level of innovation is indeed their ultimate goal. And so, should we be worried about Neuralink? My answer is yes, but not yet. And, not because of any of the specific people involved, or including Elon Musk, or, the nature of the technology. The aspirational technology described by Elon Musk when talking about Neuralink will be developed at some point. Right? There's no law of physics that prevents this from happening. And, barring some kind of moronic global catastrophe that burns us back to the Stone Age, not exactly impossible, barring a massive setback like that, I think it's certainly realistic to anticipate something like this existing in the fairly distant future. And given that Neuralink is officially going to be spending money on having someone who knows how to perform research in humans, in the brain, it's certainly not unrealistic to expect that they're planning to start implanting their devices in humans in the not too distant future. And so the question is, do we want our descendants to inherit a world where it's possible for one specific human to be in a position like that? Right? Do we want it to be possible that any one human can be quite literally omniscient? I don't think anybody really does, right? So given that it's possible, I do think it's probably a good idea to think about how we want to prepare for the emergence of technology like this. So, we're not trying to play catch up with a company, with a person who knows more about us than we know ourselves, right? Okay, that's what I have for you. If you dig this kind of discussion, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I will see you on another Sunday. Thank you so much for watching. And so, hey, Fisher, and hello, Paul. That looks like it might be a link. I'm not sure, though. So, okay, keyboard warrior. So we should protest against this. Technology is not amoral. Yeah, people like you, better informed, have a responsibility in sharing this with everyone you know. This is also keyboard warrior. We need to stop thinking advancing tech equals human progress. Yeah, well, I think it is. I am hugely in favor of advancing all of this kind of technology. But I think just like what Jennifer Doudna, who is one of the main creators of CRISPR-Cas9, the genome editing technology, or the gene editing platform, she's been playing a very significant role in preparing literally the government for what a world with CRISPR is going to look like. And I think we should probably be doing that kind of thing where, CRISPR, in terms of the ability to do gene pool editing, right? CRISPR that technology is far more advanced than like whole brain computer interfaces is even close to being. So we still have plenty of time, but I think it's prudent. I think it's a discussion that should be had, given all of the concerns that we already have about privacy, having just a private life, right? So yeah, but I mean, I fundamentally agree. Nothing is like intrinsically good or bad about innovations like these. Frank, hi Ian, do you think that these non-peer-reviewed videos are marketing material for market evaluation and fundraising? Absolutely, 100%. I mean, practically speaking, that is their main purpose, I think, is to attract investment, and just establish a brand name, right? I mean, he's very successfully deployed that strategy with essentially every other company he's ever owned, right? And so I think it'd be naive to see them as anything other than that. Here, let me see if I can get to the Pong part. Yeah, here it is. See? Okay, yeah, it's towards the end, but yeah, he's playing Pong with his brain right there. It's pretty cool. So just that the monkey, that could learn. And as you can see, right, the joystick is no longer there, right? And so, I think when you first see this video, you can see the joystick, right, sort of behind that phone. It's not plugged in, right? And they do show that it's not plugged in at a certain point. But yeah, I mean, so the monkey was able to manipulate it even without the joystick at all. Yeah, see, look, it's removed. You can see where it was, right? It's cool. I mean, it's very cool. But yeah, I mean, that's what these are, right? I mean, to have people talk about Neuralink so that Neuralink is perceived as being like the leader in this field. And yeah, of course, to attract investment. Also, Frank says, also, you apply this tech to animals, anything in the brain, and then we'll want to maybe can manipulate, control literally everything. Okay, yeah. Also, you apply this tech to animals, anything with the brain. It would be interesting, right? Yeah. I mean, I think the most dangerous animal in whom we could implant something like this is a human being for sure. But and I decided to not get into this aspect of it. But like, the reason that this technology is also very beautiful, beyond just like it would be just amazing. Imagine how transcendent it would be to be able. My parents live in a different state. I haven't seen them now for multiple years. They haven't gotten to see their granddaughter, right? It would just be magical for them to be able to just instantaneously, just experience my experience playing with my daughter, feeling the feelings that I have playing with my daughter, that they had, playing with me over 30 years ago. And also for people who are, disabled, right? People who have lost motor function due to a stroke or an injury or anything. I mean, these devices would be just a total game changer for them in being able to navigate their world and have greater agency. So, I mean, there's a lot of good that goes with this. I just think that, unless you can sort of like, unless you can imagine the sort of the practical characteristics or components of a device like this and the sort of the ramifications of having the necessary access to all these various parts of the brain to enable them to achieve what Elon Musk describes, unless you can sort of imagine that, I think it's very easy to neglect to anticipate these, potential undesirable outcomes. But anyways, thank you so much for watching, everybody. If you dig this, maybe you'll consider, liking and subscribing and everything. And otherwise, I will see you on another Sunday. Thanks for watching.